We've all watched the video, but in case you missed it, here it is again. Yes, indeed, the sandwich guy, in all his glory. He was charged with a misdemeanor for assaulting a federal officer, and he was just found not guilty by a D.C. jury. But let's not overstate the implications of the verdict. The defendant, Sean Dunn, is a former paralegal with the DOJ. Former. He was fired immediately after the incident, and after being found not guilty this week, he took a victory lap, giving media interviews claiming he was defending migrants from attack by ICE, which is false. The officer he assaulted is indeed a federal immigration officer, and the CBP officer knows what the law is governing border crossers. Now, Mr. Dunn, the sandwich guy, was not defending migrants. And as we look at the sandwich guy and the federal officer he assaulted, we see quite a physical difference there. For example, if this bizarre encounter had taken place in a bar and the person assaulted wasn't a federal officer or any type of law enforcement officer, the sandwich guy's antics could have ended very badly for him. I believe we all understand that. Now, Mr. Dunn, though, seems not to understand that. The sandwich guy doesn't get it, and he doesn't get the jury verdict either. He claims his actions were vindicated by the jury. No, the jury just said, well, we have bigger fish to fry. Slap this guy on the wrist this time. He's been fired from his job already. Just release him into the real world. Now, if the GoFundMe page for Mr. Dunn doesn't work out, maybe he thinks he'll be hired as a commentator for MSNBC or CNN, places like that. Well, maybe as a sideshow. Now, he had a cushy job at the DOJ and threw it away. And there are hundreds of people out there just like him, confronting ICE officers. Hundreds, I said. That's not a huge number. Now, maybe they're all independently wealthy because they're no longer employable. So maybe the sandwich thrower is independently wealthy, in which case he doesn't miss his former job at the DOJ, which paid very well, a cushy job. Next story. The Supreme Court of the United States is being asked to determine the lawfulness of President Trump's tariffs. Even though tariffs are a type of sanction, and sanctions are clearly within the president's emergency powers. Now, if the plaintiff wants to argue a specific tariff in a specific context, that's what he should have done. Instead, he went for a really broad argument, and there were plenty of circular discussions in this case, and they were all about terminology. For instance, let me digress for a moment. Zohran Mamdani says he's a socialist, not a communist, because if he's a communist, he can be denaturalized and deported. But his own terminology doesn't govern his case. The immigration statute is very clear about that. As we learned in the Obamacare case, the Supreme Court held that the Obamacare individual mandate is a tax and upheld the individual mandate as within the power of Congress to tax. Now, here on the tariffs, the president acted within his executive authority, so the strategy of opponents of the tariffs is to convince the Supreme Court that the tariffs are a type of tax, so that the ruling would have to line up with the Supreme Court's decision on Obamacare, namely stating that the president didn't have authority to issue the tariffs. However, the Supreme Court need not go along with that. My view is that it's reductive to categorize the tariffs as merely a tax. In fact, the tariffs are mainly not a tax, especially in this context. I believe they're mainly a national security measure as President Trump is implementing them in the current context. We can't just categorize tariffs as this or that because the mechanisms of government often defy easy categorization. We have to always look at the context. Why is the president using tariffs in the way he's done in this context? According to the Solicitor General of the United States, President Trump determined that our exploding trade deficits had brought us to the brink of an economic and national security catastrophe. He further pronounced that the traffic of fentanyl and other opioids into our country has created a public health crisis, taking hundreds of thousands of American lives. President Trump has declared that these emergencies are country-killing and not sustainable, that they threaten the bedrock of our national and economic security, and that fixing them will make America strong, financially viable, and a respected country again. So any American importer of foreign goods can avoid the tariffs by buying a different country's goods, such as American goods. Hey, what about that? On a practical level, the way that President Trump is using the tariffs gives him agility in dealing with rogue nations. For example, are the opponents of the tariffs really saying that the president has no authority to end the Ukraine war by imposing tariffs on nations that do business with Russia? It would be absurd to say that. And currently, there are sanctions on Russia and nations that do business with Russia in some sectors, such as oil and gas. Tariffs are a type of sanction and are justified on national security grounds. Now, in my view, the case wasn't made out for striking down the tariffs, especially in their entirety. Taxes have an economic impact, for example, but economic impact in and of itself doesn't justify striking down a tax. The key issue, it seems to me, is whether the president was without legal authority to impose the tariffs under his emergency powers. And the argument that the president lacked authority because the tariffs are a tax and not a sanction isn't a strong argument. Tariffs clearly are sanctions. The plaintiff, a company or importer opposed to tariffs, is literally making Joe Biden's argument. The president has authority to keep sending tanks to Ukraine if there's even one person left alive on either side to fight the war, and yet the president doesn't have the authority to impose tariffs on all nations buying Russian oil and gas to try to end the war? Sorry, I'm not with that argument. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, leave a like and don't forget to subscribe.